He whispered his dreams onto paper, hiding them from everyone. What the world did with those whispers shocked even his harshest critic. The afternoon sun pressed softly through the tall, dust-speckled windows of the classroom, spilling long golden beams across rows of desks. The air was heavy with the kind of silence that only exists when a group of children waits for something they're not sure they want to hear. The ticking of the old clock on the wall seemed louder than usual, each second stretching like a held-breath dot at the very back of the room. His shoulders drawn in as though to make himself smaller, sat Eli Johnson, 13 years old, dark-skinned, his eyes thoughtful yet cautious. He clutched a piece of paper that had been folded and unfolded so many times its edges were soft and creased. It wasn't just paper to him, it was a piece of himself, his poem Dahmer. Rowan, the literature teacher, leaned back against his desk at the front of the classroom. He tapped his pen absent-mindedly against his grade book, the sound sharp, impatient. "All right," he said with a sigh that seemed heavier than the moment deserved. "Next up, Eli. Come on then, let's hear it." The class shifted restlessly. A few students smirked, already amused at the idea of Eli the quiet boy who rarely spoke more than a few words in class, trying to read poetry aloud. Whispers slipped between desks like ripples on water. Ellie's palms were slick with sweat. As he stood, unfolding the paper with trembling hands, he could feel his heartbeat drumming in his chest, almost louder than the hum of the ceiling fan above. For a moment, he thought of pretending to be sick, of sitting back down and letting the laughter he feared swallow him whole. But something deeper, something stubborn pushed him forward. He cleared his throat. The first word slipped from his mouth like fragile bird set free. His voice quivered, thin at first, but steady enough to carry the rhythm of his lines. In the cracked sidewalks, flowers pushed through, defiant against footsteps, against the weight of the world. I see my mother's hands, tired but unyielding, sewing tomorrow from scraps of today. The classroom stilled, the whispers quieted. For a moment, even the sound of the fan seemed softer. Ellie's voice grew, not louder, but steadier, as if each word gave him permission to stand a little taller. His eyes no longer stared down at the paper, but lifted, catching light from the window, flicking across faces that stared back at him. In the alleyways, children carved games from nothing, laughing against hunger, building castles from dust, believing that maybe, just maybe, we can fly higher than the wires that cage the sky. A hush fell over the room. Students, who moments earlier had smirked, now leaned forward, caught off guard by the weight of his words. Ellie's voice, though soft, carried a rawness that pierced through the apathy of the afternoon. He read of his neighborhood, not just the broken streets, but the resilience that lived there. He wrote of dreams, fragile yet fierce, that refused to be erased by hardship. His poem wove a picture both tender and unflinching, the truth too real to ignore. By the time his last line arrived, his hands had steadied, and if the world won't give us wings, we'll teach our feet to dance, to rise, until even the sky must bow. The silence that followed was heavy, hanging in the air like a storm about to break. Ellie's chest rose and fell as he lowered the paper, his lips pressed tight, bracing himself for whatever came next. For a second, just a second, he allowed himself to believe they might understand. The sun slipped a little lower, washing the room in a deeper gold. Dust floated lazily through the light, suspended in the stillness. And then the sound of laughter cut through it all. It started low, a chuckle, almost like a cough, from Mr. Rowan at the front of the class. His shoulders shook as he let out a short, dismissive laugh, one hand waving as if brushing away the weight of Ellie's words. "Well," he said, his voice carrying a tone of amused pity. "That was something." The students, unsure at first, began to laugh too, some loudly, some nervously, some simply because they didn't want to be the only ones not laughing. The sound rolled through the classroom, sharp and merciless, bouncing off the walls until it filled every corner. Eli froze, his face burned hot, and the paper in his hands felt suddenly too heavy to hold. He wanted to crumple it, to hide it, to pretend the words had never existed. His poem, the one he had written late at night while the world slept, the one that carried pieces of his heart, was now nothing more than a joke to them. "Poetry isn't for everyone," Mr. Rowan said lightly, still smiling as he reached for his pen. "Maybe stick to sports, Eli. Something a bit more fitting." The laughter lingered even as it softened. What instinct stayed sharp. Eli sat back down slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. He folded his poem again, carefully, almost reverently, though his hands shook. He pressed it into his notebook as if hiding a secret the world wasn't ready to honor. The classroom returned to its restless hum. Pencils scratched, chairs creaked, and the golden light shifted across the floor to everyone else. The moment had already passed, but to Eli, it was seared into his chest like a brand of wound, but also a spark, for though the laughter stung, somewhere deep inside him, quieter than a whisper, something else stirred, the unshakable need to keep writing. For one fragile moment after Ellie's last line, the classroom remained in stunned silence. His words lingered in the air like smoke that refused to fade, pressing on every ear, settling into the quiet spaces no one had thought to look before. Ellie's chest rose and fell quickly, his throat tight, but in that silence, he almost felt something stir, a recognition, a respect, maybe even awe. But then, with the sharpness of a stone dropped into still water, a sound broke through, a chuckle Dahmer. Rowan leaned back in his chair, lips curled in amusement, the kind of laughter not born of joy, out of dismissal. It was soft at first, almost private, but in the quiet classroom it cracked like thunder. He shook his head and muttered under his breath, though loud enough for everyone to hear. Well, that was certainly creative. The students caught the tone before they caught the words. It was permission to laugh, permission to mock what they didn't understand. And laugh they did, a ripple at first, a snicker from the front row, a giggle from the corner, then the whole room tumbling into laughter that filled every inch of air. Eli had hoped his poem would occupy. Some of them mimicked his trembling voice, exaggerating the pauses, turning his earnest rhythm into a caricature. Others smirked at his imagery, whispering things like flowers in the sidewalk. What is that even supposed to mean? The laughter wasn't cruel in volume, but it was cruel in weight, sharp, cutting, suffocating. Eli felt it pressing down on him. The heat in his cheeks spread across his face until his ears burned. He stared down at the paper in his hand, the words now trembling as though even the ink was ashamed of itself. He wanted to disappear into the desk, to melt into the floorboards, to be anywhere but here under their gaze. The poem that had been his secret light, his safe place, now lay bare before them, mocked until it felt small, meaningless. Mr. Rowan leaned forward again, tapping the desk with his pen, still smiling a half smile of amusement. Poetry isn't for everyone, Eli, he said, his voice light, as though it were nothing more than friendly advice. Maybe stick to sports, something a little more fitting. The word fitting sliced deeper than the laughter. It didn't just mean better for you, it meant know your place. It meant someone like you doesn't belong here, not with words, not with art. Eli sat down slowly, the legs of his chair scraping against the tile in a sound that seemed louder than the laughter had been. His body felt stiff, mechanical, as though even his muscles were trying to distance themselves from what had just happened. He pressed the poem flat against the desk, smoothing the creases with shaky fingers. Though inside he wanted to tear it to shreds, his vision blurred slightly. Not from tears he would not cry, not here, but from the way shame wrapped around him like a suffocating fog. Every laugh echoed in his head, louder and louder, until it became indistinguishable from the pounding of his own heartbeat. He pressed the poem into his notebook and closed it firmly, as if locking away a piece of himself he wished no one had ever seen. But beneath the sting, beneath the humiliation that seared through him, something else flickered. It was faint, barely there, like an ember buried under ash. Hidden determination. Eli lowered his gaze, but his mind repeated the lines of his poem, quietly, stubbornly, as if to remind him, these words are yours. They are real. They are alive. No matter who laughs. He thought of the cracked sidewalks where flowers bloomed despite being stepped on. He thought of his mother's hands, tired but unyielding. He thought of the children who laughed against hunger, building castles from dust. Those images weren't gone. No amount of laughter could erase them. The bell rang, a shrill sound that scattered the students like startled birds. Backpacks zipped, chairs screeched, and the room filled with chatter as though nothing remarkable had happened at all. To them, Ellie's poem was just another fleeting amusement, a break in the monotony of the school day. But for Eli, it was everything. He stayed seated as the others filed out, his fingers still pressed to the closed notebook. He didn't look at Mr. Rowan as the teacher scribbled something into his grade book, humming to himself. He didn't look at the students, who still cast glances his way, some smirking, some indifferent. He just waited until the room was almost empty, until the Echo of their laughter had dulled into memory. When he finally rose, he did so quietly, gathering his books with care. His face was still hot, his throat tight, but his steps were steady as he walked toward the door. In his mind, the teacher's words repeated like a curse, "Stick to sports," but deep beneath the shame, that ember glowed brighter. The more he thought of it, the more it pressed against him, not anger, not yet, but a quiet defiance. Because Eli knew something Mr. Rowan didn't. He knew that words had power. They had carried him through nights when the world felt too heavy. They had given him hope when there was none. They had allowed him to dream. And if laughter was the price of speaking them aloud, then so be it. As he stepped into the hallway, the sunlight caught his face, soft and warm, a reminder that the day wasn't done yet. The laughter still echoed, but now it was only background noise. Beneath it, his heart whispered, "Right again. Don't stop. Don't ever stop." Eli walked away, cheeks still burning, paper folded tight in his notebook, carrying both his shame and his secret determination. He didn't know it yet, but that ember inside him, the one no laughter could extinguish, would one day set the world on fire. That evening, the laughter still clung to Ellie's skin like smoke he couldn't wash away. Every time he replayed the scene in his mind, the chuckle from Mr. Rowan, the ripple of mockery from his classmates, his stomach tightened, and shame pressed down like a weight he couldn't escape. But when he closed his bedroom door, when the world outside grew quiet, another part of him woke up. His room was small, walls painted a fading blue, with posters curling at the corners. A single desk sat in the corner, its surface scratched and scarred from years of use. On top lay his worn-out notebook, edges bent, filled with scribbles and half-finished poems. He pulled it closer, opened to a fresh page, and sat in the soft glow of a lamp that leaned precariously to the side. The house was still, save for the distant sound of his mother moving in the kitchen, the clink of dishes, the low hum of a radio playing old soul music. Eli hunched over the notebook, pen gripped tight, and began to write. The words came haltingly at first, stumbling across the page like timid footsteps. But as the minutes stretched into hours, his pen found its rhythm. He wrote of cracked sidewalks and blooming flowers again, but this time he expanded, weaving in the stories of people he saw every day, the neighbor who carried groceries in trembling hands but always shared what little she had, the older boys on the block who laughed loudly to hide their fear, the kids who made games out of bottle caps and stones because toys were luxuries. Line after line, Eli gave them voices, gave them dignity. He transformed hardship into resilience, despair into defiance. In broken glass, I see mirrors, showing us not what we lack, but how much we've endured. Every scar is proof we stood, even when the ground gave way. He paused to read the lines aloud, whispering them like secrets too fragile for the world. The sound of his own voice, hushed and reverent, made the words feel alive. It was as though the walls leaned closer to listen. This became his ritual each night. While the city settled into silence and the lamp cast its small circle of light, Eli filled his notebook, his hand cramped, ink smudge on his fingers, but he pressed on. Some poems came quickly, spilling out like floods. Others arrived slowly, line by line, stubborn and heavy, but no matter what, he kept writing. At school, he carried the notebook tucked deep into his backpack, never daring to show it. On the bus, he stared out the window, repeating stanzas silently to himself, memorizing rhythms like melodies. At lunch, when others joked and shoved each other playfully, he jotted down fragments on scraps of paper. Poetry became his secret life, one no laughter could touch. One afternoon, while browsing the bulletin board near the library, a small flyer caught his eye. It was for a local youth writing competition. The bold letters read, "Voices of Tomorrow, Youth Poetry Contest." Below, in smaller print, it explained that winning entries would be published in an anthology distributed to schools across the state. Eli stood frozen, reading it again and again. His heart thudded in his chest. For a moment, doubt screamed at him, "Don't even think about it. Remember the laughter. Remember Mr. Rowan's smile." The memory burned hot, but then he imagined what it would feel like to see his words in print, to hold them in his hands and know they belonged to the world, not just to him. That night, under the dim lamp, he chose the poem that had cost him the most to write, the one about his mother's hand sewn tomorrow from scraps of today. He smoothed the page carefully, rewriting it in his neatest handwriting onto a fresh sheet. Each word felt heavier, more deliberate, as though he were carving it into stone. When he finished, he stared at it for a long time. His chest tightened with fear, but beneath it was something stronger. Hope, quiet, trembling, but real. He slipped the poem into an envelope and, with hands that shook slightly, wrote the address from the flyer. He didn't tell his mother, who was tired from work and would only worry about him wasting time. He didn't tell his classmates, who would laugh. Again, he didn't even whisper it aloud to himself. This was his secret. The next morning, he walked to the post office, the envelope tucked deep in his backpack. The building smelled faintly of ink and paper, with the soft murmur of people mailing bills and packages. When it was his turn, he slid the envelope across the counter. The postal worker barely glanced at it, stamping it with practiced efficiency. Before tossing it into a bin with dozens of others dot to them, it was just another letter to Eli. It was everything. He left the post office with his hands shoved deep into his pockets, shoulders hunched, trying to look casual, but inside, his heart raced. He had done it. He had taken the words they laughed at and dared to send them into the world. That night, he wrote again, and the night after that, and the night after that. Each poem was a small act of rebellion, a way of telling himself, I matter, my voice matters, even if they don't hear it now. One day they will. He whispered his stanzas to the walls, to the quiet night air drifting in through the window, to the shadows in his room. His words weren't just poems anymore, they were prayers, promises, seeds he was planting in secret. And though no one knew it yet, not his classmates, not Mr. Rowan, not even his mother, those seeds were already beginning to grow. The months that followed moved quietly, as seasons tend to do. The heat of late summer softened into crisp autumn, leaves turning brittle and gold before falling in swirling patterns. Across the schoolyard, Eli carried on as he always did, quiet, observant, the notebook still tucked deep in his backpack like a hidden heartbeat. He never told anyone about the contest. Once the envelope left his hands at the post office, he forced himself not to dwell on it. Some nights, when the lamp flickered low and the house was still, he wondered what had become of his words. Were they read, discarded, laughed at by strangers, as they had been at school? When doubt grew too heavy, he did the only thing he knew. He kept writing, page after page. His notebook thickened until the binding strained to hold it all. By the time winter settled in, the competition was a faded memory. Then came the day that would change everything. It was an ordinary afternoon, the sun dipping low and casting honey-colored light across the classroom floor. Students slouched in their chairs, weary from the monotony of the day. Mr. Rowan stood at the front, a stack of fresh papers in his hand. His voice, usually tired and droning, carried a strange flicker of enthusiasm. Today, he began, tapping the stack against the desk to straighten it. We begin a new unit. Modern voice is in poetry. These are selections from contemporary poets, young writers who are shaping the conversation in literature today. A ripple of groans moved through the class. Another poetry unit, more metaphors to dissect, more essays to write. But Mr. Rowan ignored them. He began passing out the papers, one by one, rows of white sheets crisp with freshly printed ink. I want you all to take a few minutes to read this poem, he instructed. We'll discuss its imagery and themes afterward. Eli accepted his copy with mild disinterest, sliding it onto his desk. He smoothed the paper absent-mindedly, not yet looking at it. His mind wandered, half focused on the whispers of his classmates and the faint scratching of chairs. Then, almost reluctantly, his eyes dropped to the page. The title hit him first. Flowers Through Concrete. His chest tightened. Line by line, his gaze traveled down the page. Every word was his, written in those lonely hours under the dim lamp, whispered to the silence of his bedroom. The imagery of cracked sidewalks, of children building castles from dust, of his mother's hand sewing tomorrow from scraps of today. There it all was, laid bare in neat black print for everyone to see. And at the bottom, in bold type, the name, Eli Johnson, for a heartbeat. The world seemed to stop. Around him, murmurs began to rise. Students leaned across desks, tapping their friends, whispering his name with disbelief. Wait, Eli. Like our Eli. One boy snatched the paper from his desk neighbor, eyes widening as he compared the name at the bottom to the quiet figure sitting in the back row. Girls whispered in half-shocked admiration, boys in baffled tones. Eli sat frozen, the paper trembling faintly beneath his hands, his breath caught in his throat, too shallow, too fast. The room blurred at the edges as if the sunlight had grown to bright dimmer, Rowan cleared his throat, straightening his tie, though his face betrayed a flicker of unease. "This piece," he said carefully, "was awarded first place in the state's Voices of Tomorrow Youth Poetry Competition. It has since been selected as part of the official curriculum. Quite an achievement." The words struck Eli like thunder. First place, curriculum. His poem mocked, laughed at, dismissed was now part of the very material they were required to study. Whispers gave way to stares. Dozens of eyes turned toward him. Wide with shock, curiosity, even a hint of respect. Ellie's ears burned, his body rigid under the sudden attention. He wanted to shrink, to vanish, but at the same time, a current of something fierce surged in his chest. Pride, vindication. The irony was unbearable. The same teacher who had chuckled at his trembling voice now stood at the front of the class, holding up his poem as an example of literary merit. The same students who had mimicked his stanzas now traced the lines in silence. Forced to reckon with them, let's analyze the imagery here. Mr. Rowan continued, his voice professional, but tight. He gestured toward the stanza about cracked sidewalks. "What does this symbolize? What is the poet?" He faltered briefly, his eyes flicking toward Eli before continuing. "What is Johnson trying to express?" The students hesitated, unsure how to proceed. One girl raised her hand slowly. "It's about resilience, right? Like, even in broken places, life finds a way to grow." "Exactly," Mr. Rowan said, nodding quickly, as though eager to move past his discomfort. Resilience, defiance against circumstance. Eli sat still, listening as his classmates dissected his words with the seriousness of scholars. Each observation landed differently in his chest, strange, surreal, both humbling and empowering. For the first time, his voice wasn't laughed at. It wasn't dismissed. It was studied, discussed, respected. His hands tightened around the paper, grounding himself in the reality of it. This was no dream. This was happening. His poem had left the safety of his notebook, traveled out into the world, and returned stronger than he had ever imagined, wearing the armor of recognition. In the corner of his vision, Mr. Rowan glanced his way again, the faintest trace of something unreadable flickering in his eyes. Regret, perhaps, or maybe disbelief. Whatever it was, Eli didn't need it. He had something greater now. As the discussion continued, Eli lifted his gaze. He no longer looked at the floor, no longer shrank into his seat. For the first time in that classroom, he allowed himself to be seen. The laughter of months past echoed, faintly in memory, but it no longer carried weight. The ember he had protected in secret now burned openly, its flame undeniable. Eli Johnson, the boy they once mocked, was now a voice that could not be silenced. Mr. Rowan stood at the front of the classroom with Ellie's poem in his hands, his knuckles tightening around the paper as though it might slip away. The lines on his face deepened, his jaw set firmly, but there was no disguising the stiffness in his expression. He looked down at the poem again, reading silently, lips pressing together as though the words carried a weight he hadn't expected to feel. The laughter he had once given the quick, careless chuckle that had set the whole class against the boy seemed to echo faintly in the air. It wasn't real, not in this moment, but it lived in memory, haunting the silence that filled the space between teacher and student. That chuckle, that dismissal, stood now in painful contrast to the words before him, words he could not ignore. "All right," he said at last, his voice lower than usual, lacking its typical crispness. Let's look more closely at this stanza." He pointed to the lines about Ellie's mother's hands, her quiet resilience woven into scraps of tomorrow. His throat tightened slightly before he continued. "What do you notice here? What is the poet showing us about survival, about strength?" The class was unusually quiet, not with boredom, but with focus. A hand rose, hesitant. "It feels personal," a girl said softly. "Like he's not just writing poetry, he's writing truth. His truth." Mr. Rowan nodded slowly, almost too slowly, as though the words themselves struck deeper than he wanted to admit. "Yes," he replied, his voice catching for a fraction of a second. "Yes, truth. That's exactly it." He glanced up, and his eyes landed on Eli. For the first time since he had known the boy, Rowan really saw him, not the quiet kid in the back, not the student who avoided attention, but a writer, an observer, someone who carried entire worlds inside him. And it unsettled him, because it forced Rowan to face his own blindness. He had laughed at those worlds. The realization pressed into him, sharp as glass. He remembered how easily he had dismissed Eli months before, waving away his effort like one swats at a fly. He had believed, without even questioning it, that poetry did not belong to the boy sitting quietly before him. That words belonged elsewhere to others, not to him, and yet here he was. His poem stamped with recognition, placed into the state. Curriculum. The irony was merciless. Rowan, who had told Eli to stick to sports, was now required to dissect his imagery, his metaphors, his meaning. Forced to treat seriously what he had once ridiculed. Another student raised his hand. The part about kids making castles from dust-its. I don't know, it made me feel something. Like hope, even when there's nothing, you can still create something. Yes. Rowan answered quickly, almost eager, as though clinging to the comfort of analysis to shield himself from his guilt. That's exactly right. Hope in the face of hardship. Creation where there is nothing. His voice, however, betrayed a tremor. As the discussion unfolded, the classroom began to buzz with engagement. Students who rarely participated leaned forward, offering thoughts. They spoke of resilience, of identity, of how ordinary images, flowers, and cracked sidewalks. Laughter against hunger could carry extraordinary power. And through it all, Eli sat quietly at his desk, watching. He did not smirk. He did not gloat. He did not seek revenge in his eyes. Instead, there was a quiet pride about him, something steady and unshakable. His lips pressed into a calm line, his shoulders relaxed, his gaze fixed not on Rowan, but on the words before him. For Eli, this moment wasn't about triumphing over a teacher. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about validation, proof that his voice mattered, that his words carried weight, that the laughter had been wrong. Rowan felt that gaze without Eli even looking at him, and with it came a deep, unspoken understanding. The boy did not need to rub it in. The poem itself was enough. The room felt strangely heavy to Rowan. Each second an uncomfortable mirror held up to his own prejudice. He thought back to his years of teaching, the countless students he had brushed aside, the ones he had encouraged, the ones he had broken without even noticing. How many voices had he silenced because they did not fit his narrow view of what a poet looked like? As he guided the class through the imagery of Ellie's verses, the words he spoke began to feel less like an analysis for his students and more like a confession to himself. Every metaphor he unpacked revealed not just resilience in the poem, but the blind spots in his own teaching. His earlier chuckle haunted him, replaying in his mind. He imagined how it must have sounded to Eli cutting, final, a door slammed shut. The shame of it pressed into his chest, making it hard to breathe. Still, Rowan pressed on. His role required it. He pointed to another stanza, asked another question, encouraged another interpretation, yet his voice lacked its usual authority. Instead, there was a humility creeping in, a softness that had never been there before. The class, meanwhile, turned their attention again and again toward Eli, not with ridicule this time, but with curiosity, respect, perhaps even admiration. And though he remained quiet, they noticed the spark in his eyes, the way his posture was no longer hunched, but upright, the way he seemed to take up more space without moving at all. When the discussion ended and the bell rang, the students filed out, still murmuring about the poem. Copies of Flowers Through Concrete were folded into backpacks, tucked into binders, and Rowan lingered at the front of the room, staring down at the poem in his hands long after everyone else had left. He read the lines again, slower this time, as though trying to hear the voice behind them, the trembling but determined voice that had once filled this room, the voice he had crushed with laughter. For the first time, Mr. Rowan admitted to himself what he should have known all along. The boy he had dismissed was a poet, and not just any poet. A poet whose words now belonged not just to him, but to classrooms, to readers, to the world. Rowan set the paper down gently, his hand lingering on it. His face was tight, his thoughts loud, but above all, he knew this. His laughter had been wrong. Terribly, undeniably wrong. At the back of the room, Eli gathered his things. He did not look at Rowan, not directly, but as he slipped a paper copy of his own poem into his notebook, his eyes glinted with quiet fire. It wasn't vengeance. It was victory of a different kind. The classroom seemed brighter that afternoon, though no one could explain why. Perhaps it was the way the sunlight caught on the white pages of the curriculum handouts, illuminating Ellie's name at the bottom of each copy, or maybe it was the weight of silence that hung in the air, a silence not born of mockery this time, but of reverence. Eli sat at his desk, his paper folded neatly in front of him. He didn't fidget. He didn't look around to see if anyone was whispering. He simply breathed, steady and calm, as the words he had once whispered under a dim lamp were now spoken aloud by voices that had once laughed at him. Dahmer, Rowan's voice, the same one that had sliced so easily with mockery months ago, now carried an unsteady tremor as he read the opening lines of Ellie's poem. The streetlights hum. When the night gets heavy, there glow like watchful eyes over dreams too fragile to name. I walk beneath them, carrying both silence and song, a boy with ink-stained hands, chasing the horizon. The students listen, their laughter gone, replaced with a curious hush. Some glanced at Eli, their eyes wide with something that looked almost like apology. Others simply stared at the page, as though seeing poetry for the first time, as though realizing it didn't belong only to great names and textbooks, but could come from someone who sat beside them every day. Dahmer, Rowan cleared his throat. Class, he said, his tone uneven, we're going to analyze this poem. Notice how Eli uses imagery of light and shadow to describe resilience. Notice how personal experience becomes universal here. His words were the words of a teacher, but his eyes betrayed something else, remorse, perhaps even shame. And yet, Eli did not smirk. He did not gloat or revel in the irony. Instead, he sat quietly, his gaze fixed not on his teacher, but on the words. The words were bigger than pride, bigger than vengeance. They were his truth, finally heard. The lesson carried on. Students raised their hands hesitantly at first, then with eagerness, they spoke of voice, of identity, of hope stitched into struggle. They quoted lines aloud, repeating them as though savoring their taste. And in that classroom, for the first time, Ellie's silence was not the mark of invisibility, it was the mark of strength. At home that evening, his mother sat at the kitchen table with a copy of the curriculum in her hands. Her eyes brimmed with tears as she traced her finger over her son's name. She remembered the night she had passed his room, seeing only the thin glow of his lamp beneath the door, unaware of the world's being built on the other side. You never told me, she whispered softly, half in awe, half in reproach. Eli shrugged, shy as always. But there was a new steadiness in him. I didn't know if it mattered. Oh, it matters, she said, pulling him into her arms. It matters more than you know. Weeks turned into months, and Ellie's poem was read not only in his own classroom, but across schools in the state. Teachers dissected his stanzas, students underlined his imagery. A young writer some as shy as Eli once was found courage in the fact that someone like them had written words that mattered. The laughter that had once filled the classroom became only a memory, distant and hollow compared to the resonance of Ellie's voice now etched into the pages of curriculum. And as for Mr. Rowan, each time he stood before the class to guide them through Ellie's poem, he was forced to confront his own failure. The chuckle he once thought harmless now echoed in his ears like a scar. Yet in that sting came a lesson not only for him, but for every student who witnessed the shift. The narrator's voice settled over the final image, Eli walking home, his backpack slung over his shoulder, the late afternoon sun warming his face. His stride was not hurried, not uncertain. He carried himself with quiet assurance, as though every step was a line of a poem only he could write. Sometimes, the narrator intoned, the voices most easily silenced are the ones the world most needs to hear. Greatness doesn't always announce itself loudly. It begins in whispers, in words written in secret, in dreams laughed at by others. And one day, those whispers become lessons for everyone. The camera lingered on Ellie's face, soft, contemplative, and quietly radiant. His eyes, once hesitant to meet the world, now held a spark that even mockery could not dim. In the end, it wasn't the laughter that endured. It was the poem. It was the voice. It was the boy who refused to stop writing.